Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're plunging into a topic that is, well, it's all around us, often hidden in plain sight, the value of historic buildings and places.
Yeah.
We've pulled together a really fascinating stack of sources for this deep dive, pulling threads from, the grand, sometimes complicated estates of the English countryside,
hmm
all the way to the detailed work of measuring economic impact in American towns and cities.
That's right. Our core mission today is really to unpack the multifaceted value these places hold. I mean, it's easy to see them just as beautiful old structures, right? Maybe symbols of nostalgia.
Sure.
But our sources push us to look deeper at their profound historical and cultural significance, absolutely, but also at the surprising, often complex, and very real economic impacts they have on communities today.
Exactly. We want to understand the forces that shape these places, how they came to be, why some adapted and survived while others, well, crumbled. How new research is shining a light on challenging, sometimes uncomfortable hidden histories embedded within them, and critically, how experts are actually trying to put numbers to the tangible economic contributions that historic preservation makes right now.
So get ready. This deep dive will, I think, challenge you to see that familiar historic building on your street, or maybe that charming historic district you visit.
Hmm.
Not just as a static relic of a bygone era, but as a dynamic entity. These places are deeply connected to complex pasts and profoundly relevant to our present, influencing everything from local jobs and property values to the very way we understand our shared history. Let's unpack this.
Let's start our journey by crossing the pond, shall we? Our sources take us back to the English country house, but maybe not the image you have from a costume drama. These weren't always just grand homes for leisurely living.
Correct. I mean, if you go back before the Tudor era, say into the medieval period, larger houses in England were fundamentally different. They were very often fortified.
Right, defenses were key.
Absolutely, reflecting the position of their owners. These were feudal lords, essentially regional overlords, and their houses needed to be defensible strongholds. Security and defense were paramount, defining their architecture and their purpose.
But then came the Tudor period, and a key moment was the reign of Henry VIII. This brought a degree of political stability that, well, it shifted the priorities for the landed elite, didn't it?
It really did.
This is when you start to see the construction of the first truly unfortified great houses.
Absolutely, a seismic shift. And perhaps the single biggest catalyst for this change was the dissolution of the monasteries. This meant vast tracts of land and numerous substantial buildings, abbeys, priories, monastic granges suddenly came into the crown's possession. Henry VIII then granted these former ecclesiastical properties to his favorites, often as rewards for loyalty or service.
So instead of religious institutions, these became private residences.
Precisely. And they were often huge, already built to a high standard, requiring, conversion rather than entirely new construction.
Makes sense.
This is why you see houses today with names like Woburn Abbey or Ford Abbey. They have religious origins, but are now grand private mansions or public attractions. The sheer variety of terms used to describe country houses over time, palace, castle, court, hall, mansion, park, house, manor, place, it really reflects this diverse and evolving origin story.
And this leads directly into what our sources describe as the era of powerhouses. These were, well, more than just homes. They were deliberate instruments of power.
Fundamentally, yes. These great houses, built from the late Tudor period onwards, were often designed and constructed on a palatial scale. Their purpose for the country's most powerful individuals was explicit, to display their status, their immense wealth, and their political ambitions.
You could really picture it.
Think of the scale of plays like Hampton Court Palace or Burghley House from the Tudor era, or later architectural marvels like Castle Howard, Kettleston Hall, or Holkham Hall.
And the architectural choices were part of that statement, weren't they? Making a splash.
Absolutely. They were built or entirely rebuilt by the most eminent architects of the day in the absolute height of fashion. Kettleston Hall, for instance, saw contributions from both Matthew Brettingham and later Robert Adam, reflecting the changing tastes and the owner's desire to be at the forefront of architectural style.
Right.
A defining feature for entertaining eminent guests was the suite of Baroque state apartments, Often arranged in enfilade, a sequence of rooms with doors aligned on a single axis.
Ah, that long view through the rooms.
Exactly. It allowed a processional flow that emphasized formality and status. This elaborate entertainment was essential for maintaining political connections and influence.
So there was this very public, performative aspect to these houses,
Right.
but our sources mention a contrast within the house itself.
Yes, that's interesting. Despite the grandeur of the state apartments designed for public display and ceremony, the family would invariably have a smaller, more private suite of rooms.
Retreat.
Exactly, their retreat, where they could withdraw from the constant presence of guests, officials, and the multitude of servants required to run such a large establishment. These houses were always conceived as an alternative to a London house, designed to be lived in with a significant degree of ceremony and pomp, enabling the owner to conduct business, both social and political, outside the capital.
And these estates weren't just residential showplaces, they were major economic powerhouses in their own right.
Oh, absolutely crucial hubs. With vast numbers of indoor and outdoor staff, from butlers and maids to gamekeepers and farm laborers, the country houses were fundamental sources of employment for rural communities.
Right.
And until the agricultural depressions that began in the 1870s, the landed estates provided the owners with their principal income. The health of the estate directly supported the house and the entire ecosystem of the surrounding area.
But that era, that traditional model of the country house as a self-sustaining economic and political center, reached what's described as its swan song.
It did. The period spanning the late 19th and early 20th centuries marked the definitive end of the traditional country house lifestyle as it had been known for centuries. Several severe financial pressures converged.
Hey, are they?
Well, increased taxation, which started to bite even before World War I, placed a significant burden on inherited wealth and landed income. And then the agricultural depression of the 1870s, which lasted for decades.
Decades. Wow.
Yes, it severely impacted the income generated by the estates, leaving many owners struggling to cover their expenses.
This is where you hear stories of owners having to get creative to survive, isn't it?
Precisely. Some owners had alternative income streams from banking or trade that helped them weather the storm. Others, facing severe financial straits, famously married American heiresses.
Wow, the dollar princesses.
That's the term, yes. Women from wealthy industrialist families in the U.S., their dowries injected much-needed capital to save houses and maintain lifestyles, like the notable example of the Duke of Marlborough.
And then came World War I, which accelerated the decline.
It dealt another significant blow. Huge numbers of the male staff, often the backbone of the outdoor state workforce, left to fight. Women and others went to work in munitions factories or other war industries.
And things didn't just snap back afterwards?
No, crucially, many never returned to rural life after the war, or if they did, they sought better paid jobs in towns. This exacerbated staffing shortages on estates, making them expensive and difficult to maintain.
And if WWI was a blow, WWII was often the final one for many.
Absolutely devastating for some. During the war, many country houses were requisitioned by the government, used as military hospitals, training centers, command centers, or administrative offices.
So they worked hard during the war.
Very hard, and when they were returned to their owners after 1945, they were often in very poor repair, requiring extensive and costly restoration work. Owners faced even higher rates of taxation than before the war, agricultural incomes continued to decline, and tragically, many aristocratic families had lost heirs in both world wars.
Oh, wow, both.
Yes, meaning the succession was broken, and there often wasn't a next generation prepared or able to take on the burden of the house.
So with crippling costs and diminished resources, what was the reality for hundreds of these houses?
The stark and harsh reality was demolition. The only way to realize capital was to sell off the contents, holding massive auctions that dispersed centuries of collections, and then demolish the house itself.
Just knock it down.
Yes, selling off valuable architectural features like stone, fireplaces, and paneling. Our sources note that many of these exquisite architectural elements were actually bought and transported to the U.S.
Really? Shipped across the Atlantic?
Absolutely. Hundreds of country houses were lost in this way, demolished between the early 20th century and the early 1970s. A huge loss of heritage.
Survival often required a fundamental change in purpose or even ownership then.
Yes. Recognizing the continuing need for grand houses for state entertaining and prestige, especially for government ministers who might not own such a place themselves, some were donated to the nation. Chequers was a pioneering example.
The Prime Minister's country residence.
Exactly. Donated by Viscount Lee of Fareham in 1917 for the use of the Prime Minister, a role it still serves today. Similarly, Chevening House and Dorneywood were acquired for the use of high-ranking ministers.
So the survivors today represent a transformation, a different kind of existence.
Entirely. Many have found new lives and purposes repurposed as hotels, schools, hospitals, or museums, opening their doors to the public in a way their original owners could barely have imagined. Others survived as conserved ruins, protected for their historical and architectural significance, even in decay.
And they're protected now.
Yes, the vast majority of survivors are now designated as Grade 1 or 2 listed buildings. This provides statutory protection against inappropriate alteration or demolition, but it also means that necessary restoration and ongoing maintenance work is incredibly expensive and subject to strict regulations.
A double-edged sword.
It can be.
Yeah.
The restoration of Copt Hall in Essex, which began way back in 1995, is cited as an example of the immense financial and time commitment required. Our sources note it's still ongoing today.
It's a fascinating journey, seeing them go from fortified private power bases to public heritage sites or commercial ventures. But there's another crucial layer our sources explore, one that delves into the deeper, sometimes uncomfortable histories embedded within these places.
Yes, and what's fascinating here is how recent scholarship is moving beyond earlier interpretations. These often focus heavily on the country house solely as a political statement tied directly to the owner's place in national politics.
Right. Mark Jewar's concept of the country house is primarily a political powerhouse, where even changes in internal planning reflected the owner's changing self-image and political ambition. That's been hugely influential, hasn't it?
Hugely, and it remains influential, informing both academic study and popular understanding, even if the direct automatic link between vast land ownership and holding political power at the highest level has largely faded. However, our sources point out a significant challenge.
Which is?
Well, with asserting a direct political motive for every single artistic or decorative decision made within these houses.
It risks oversimplification, making everything about politics.
Precisely. It can be overly reductive, saying every acquired sculpture or painting, every commissioned new work, or even the placement of inherited pieces was solely for political signaling, overlooks the complexity of regional variations in taste and politics. Furthermore, specific political messages embedded in art or architecture were often highly topical, dependent on a specific group of people, a particular place, and shared understanding at a fleeting moment in time.
So the meaning gets lost quickly.
Exactly. What was a clear political allusion to one generation could quickly become an anachronism, its meaning lost to the next. It's only in genuinely exceptional cases that specific, recoverable political messages can be clearly identified and understood from collection items.
But recent scholarship is expanding the field of vision in a really important way, looking beyond just local and national politics to the country house's deep entanglement in imperial politics.
This is where the history becomes both truly insightful and, for many, quite difficult to confront. The country house wasn't a self-contained bubble. It was a dynamic participant in global patterns of trade, consumption, and power.
Okay.
Recent research compellingly demonstrates how connections to the wider world, including the brutal realities of the Atlantic slave economy, were not only foundational to the wealth that built and maintained these houses, but were sometimes even reflected in their architecture and collections.
And our sources give specific, vivid examples that bring this connection to life.
One particularly striking example mentioned is at Clarendon Park. Until relatively recently, the Marble Hall contained 2 busts specifically depicting enslaved people.
Wow, depictions of enslaved people.
Yes. These figures were directly linked to the Onslow family's sugar plantations in Jamaica. Our sources highlight that these busts were actually exceptional in their direct and visible reference to the source of the family's wealth from slavery. More often, the connection was deliberately obscured.
So, the country house wasn't just built by wealth from places like the Caribbean. It was sometimes used to hide or distance owners from that involvement.
That's a key insight from the research. Pieces like Vizagapatam furniture, intricately inlaid ivory pieces brought into the Townsend family, for instance, through a marriage, are linked to wealth derived from individuals like Edward Harrison, who was governor of Fort St. George in Madras.
So connections to India, too.
Yes. But far more typically, the country house served as a kind of masking device for those involved in the Atlantic slave economy. By moving wealth generated from brutal exploitation in the colonies into land, property, and cultural goods in England, owners could distance themselves physically and symbolically from the source, presenting themselves instead as traditional landed gentry.
The Legacies of British Slave Ownership project sounds absolutely fundamental to uncovering these connections.
It is a truly critical piece of research. By painstakingly using compensation records from the abolition of slavery in British colonies in the 1830s.
Compensation paid to the slave owners, right?
Exactly. Compensation paid to the owners for the loss of property, meaning enslaved people. By using these records, scholars can trace how that slave resource capital flowed into England. This capital was fungible, meaning it could be mixed and exchanged easily with other forms of wealth, funding investment decisions, debt repayment, and yes, the purchase or commission of artworks and the maintenance of country houses and estates. It charts a direct, often undeniable link between slavery and the country house.
It really forces a new perspective when you visit these places, doesn't it? The beauty and grandeur is still there, but you also see the layers of history, including the uncomfortable ones.
Absolutely. Exploring how art and material culture within these houses were used, sometimes explicitly, sometimes subtly, to normalize the profound power imbalances and political inequalities at the heart of the British imperial project is now a vital area of scholarly interest.
Even the landscapes.
Yes, even research into the seemingly idyllic pastoral landscapes designed by someone like Lancelot Capability Brown shows how profits derived directly from the slave trade or from ancillary industries that service the slave economy funded the creation of these quintessentially English scenes. The beauty is intertwined with the difficult past.
So the biggest challenge for heritage organizations today, like the National Trust and historic houses, and for private owners who open their homes, is grappling with how to present and interpret these difficult global histories to the millions of visitors they receive.
It's perhaps the most significant challenge they face right now. Country houses are potentially incredible sites for public history, but for a long time they were presented, often as places purely about English history, architecture, and the lives of famous families,
Right, a simpler story.
without fully acknowledging and engaging with the implications of Britain's colonial past, particularly slavery, which was foundational to so much of the wealth displayed.
But the academic research is making these connections increasingly undeniable.
It is. There's a rapidly growing body of recent academic work, from vast digital data sets mapping connections to individual PhD projects detailing specific family histories, showing how deeply slavery and other forms of imperial exploitation were intertwined with country houses.
How so?
While through owners' investments in problematic companies like the South Sea Company, holding government offices that administered slave colonies, making advantageous marriages to West Indian heiresses whose wealth derived from plantations, and patronizing artists and architects using slave-derived wealth. The links are often complex but traceable.
And we're seeing heritage organizations taking different approaches to address this publicly. It sounds sensitive.
Yes, and it's a live, evolving process that can be fraught with difficulty. The example cited of Dunham Massey temporarily removing a statue depicting an enslaved person back in June 2020 highlights the sensitivity.
That was around the time of the Colston statue removal in Bristol.
Exactly. It linked into those broader public movements and debates. It shows how quickly these historical interpretations can become points of contemporary contention and public reaction.
How does this research impact how collections are displayed and interpreted to visitors then? It must change things.
Audits, such as the one mentioned for the National Trust examining links to slavery, have significant implications. Curating objects in context, showing them as part of complex historic assemblages within the house, has always been a key differentiator for country houses compared to museum displays.
True, they feel more lived in.
Right. But providing visible interpretation that honestly engages with these contentious legacies requires substantial ongoing investment in high-quality research to contextualize objects, buildings, and landscapes properly. It's not enough just to display things. You need to explain their full story, the difficult parts included.
And it opens up opportunities to tell previously marginalized or hidden stories, too. That seems like a positive.
Absolutely, and this is one of the positive outcomes. Researching the 27 portraits in National Trust collections that include black sitters, for example, that's referenced in the source, is a specific project that opens up much wider histories.
Wider histories of who?
It allows us to understand more about the lives of Black and Asian people who lived and worked on or near these estates from the 17th century onwards. This research also helps contextualize other historical representations of racial difference found in collections, like allegorical portrayals of continents by artists such as Antonio Zucchi, which might contain stereotypical or problematic imagery. Understanding the full historical context is key.
It's good to hear that private owners are also getting guidance on this, not just the big organizations.
Yes, organizations like Historic Houses, which represents many private owners, have published guidance for their members. This guidance specifically addresses how to acknowledge and interpret the absence or misrepresentation of stories relating to groups whose histories haven't always been prominent: gay people, non-white people, women, disabled people, and others within the narratives traditionally told about country houses.
So it's broadening the story being told.
Exactly. Other major organizations like English Heritage and the National Trust for Scotland are also actively engaging with these global connections and difficult histories. It's a sector-wide shift, really.
So the country house, having survived the economic crises of the 20th century, is now finding a new footing, in part by adapting to this role as a site of heritage, even difficult heritage.
That's a central argument in the sources. The traditional elite, having lost much of their direct political power, have successfully adapted to become, or at least to present themselves as, guardians of a newly constructed national heritage.
How did they make that argument?
The argument made to the public and the government was often that this precious national heritage was best cared for in situ by the existing owners who had inherited responsibility for it. Giles Worsley is quoted with that sharp observation. "The country house has learnt to survive by disassociating itself from power."
Interesting. So shifting from power brokers to cultural custodians.
Essentially, yes. By becoming custodians of culture rather than centers of political might, they found a new path to relevance and survival.
And tax incentives have been key to enabling that survival in private hands.
Crucially so. The conditional exemption tax incentive scheme in the UK offers significant tax relief on inheritance tax and capital gains tax for properties, land, and objects of historical, scientific, or artistic interest.
But there's a condition, right?
Yes, on the condition that they are properly maintained and, importantly, made accessible to the public. This explicitly encourages preservation in private ownership for public benefit.
But there's also criticism of this system. It sounds like it could be controversial.
Yes, our sources note the criticism. Some view this scheme, along with mechanisms like acceptance in lieu agreements, where tax is paid by transferring significant artworks or objects to public collections, as a way for inherited wealth to retain ancestral heirlooms and significant assets.
With the public footing some of the bill.
Well, the argument is that a considerable portion of the conservation and access costs are effectively met by the taxpayer through foregone tax revenue or public funding for acquired items.
That open inheritance art project you mentioned sounds like it was trying to shed light on this.
It was an interesting initiative by the University of York and the Open Data Institute. It attempted to create a publicly searchable online database of artworks and objects that had received conditional exemption, calling it one of the largest secret collections held behind closed doors but benefiting from public tax relief.
Did it work?
Well, the project was short-lived, which, as our sources suggest, highlights the ongoing tension and the need for more constructive dialogue between private owners, who understandably value their privacy and face the real costs of stewardship, and the scholarly and public communities who believe there should be greater transparency and access to these collections that are preserved, ultimately with public support. It's a complex balance.
So we've traced the arc of the English country house, from medieval fortification to modern heritage site, grappling with its complex history. Now, moving from those large historical estates to contemporary rural land holdings and then across the Atlantic to the specific challenge of measuring the value of history in American communities,
Yeah.
you start to see connecting threads, don't you?
Absolutely. The historical challenges of taxation and economic change that forced those English houses to adapt. Those same forces continue to shape the business of rural estates today, albeit in different forms. While the source we're drawing from here focuses specifically on strategic planning for rural estates in July 2020, set against the backdrop of the potential impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Okay, so that's the specific context.
Yes, but the fundamental principle holds true. Times of significant change inevitably bring both considerable threats and new opportunities.
And estates, as complex businesses, had to look hard at all their operations, especially then.
Yes, They faced and continue to face the reality of income streams potentially drying up or facing significant shortfalls across their diverse portfolios. Commercial property, residential rents, retail outlets, and crucially, tourism-related income, which was heavily impacted by the pandemic context of the source.
So a time for review.
Exactly. It was and remains a critical time for these estates to conduct a thorough review, identifying where the vulnerabilities lie, but also where the opportunities for innovation and investment are.
So in that 2020 context, what we're seeing is key potential growth areas for rural estates.
One significant area identified was the potential for developing rural hubs. This was a response to the anticipated trend of families and businesses looking to leave urban centers and move into the countryside, accelerated by changes in working patterns during the pandemic.
People moving out of cities.
Right. Estates, with their land and existing infrastructure, have a unique opportunity to create attractive places for living and working. This involves actively seeking to attract wealth creators, individuals, or businesses who can bring new economic activity, entrepreneurial energy, and jobs to the countryside, helping to reinvigorate rural economies and revive village communities.
And attracting those people and businesses requires investment,
Right.
right? You can't just expect them to show up.
Absolutely critical investment. This
Mhm.
includes upgrading and adapting property, improving estate infrastructure like roads and utilities, and perhaps most critically in the modern context, ensuring significantly improved digital connectivity, robust broadband, is now essential infrastructure for attracting remote workers and businesses.
Broadband is key everywhere now. The financial landscape at that specific moment offered a certain advantage too.
It did. Low interest rates made it a relatively good time to access capital for investment, provided the estate business could develop and grow new income streams faster than the cost of borrowing that money.
A calculated risk.
Exactly. Furthermore, job losses occurring in other sectors during the pandemic created a potential pool of skilled entrepreneurial talent who might be available for joint ventures or other innovative business models on estates, bringing new expertise and energy.
So the core message was, and still is, don't wait, be proactive.
Precisely. Estates cannot afford to be passive in the face of uncertainty. They need to be proactive in reviewing their assets and strategies to navigate change successfully and position themselves to flourish.
How? What kind of?
This involves actively pursuing areas like diversification, looking for non-traditional income sources beyond farming or traditional rents, rural placemaking, deliberately shaping the character and quality of the rural environment to make it a desirable place to live, work, and visit, and leveraging sophisticated business analysis tools like the time to review tool mentioned by property consultants Strutton Parker in the source to make informed strategic decisions.
Looking ahead, as of the January 2025 outlook mentioned in the source for land managers, what were presented as the big themes on the horizon? What are they facing now?
Our sources highlight significant challenges on the horizon, including ongoing changes to the tax regime impacting land and inheritance, and increasingly the growing unavoidable impacts of climate change.
Climate change impacts everything.
It really does, affecting everything from farming practices to insurance and environmental management responsibilities. The reality is that modern rural estates are incredibly diverse businesses.
More than just farming.
Oh, yes. Often encompassing traditional farming and forestry alongside complex property management portfolios, environmental conservation work, renewable energy projects, new ventures like viticulture wine production.
Wine from UK estates.
Interesting. It's a growing area. And tourism, of course. All these areas are subject to external pressures, requiring constant vigilance, adaptation, and strategic thinking.
So we've journeyed from the historical and contemporary business of large UK estates to the need to quantify value. Transitioning now to a specific focus on how we measure the economic impact of historic places, particularly in the U.S. Our sources delve into this critical work of, well, putting numbers to preservation.
It's a fascinating shift. The U.S. historic preservation movement, much like its UK counterpart initially, started quite narrowly. Its origins are often traced back to efforts focused on saving individual national monuments.
There's Mount Vernon.
Exactly, like Anne Pamela Cunningham's tireless work to preserve Mount Vernon, George Washington's home, starting way back in 1853. A focus on really iconic sites.
So a focus on famous places tied to famous people initially.
Primarily, yes. But over time, the concept of heritage and the purposes of preservation began to widen considerably. By the time the National Historic Preservation Act, the NHPA, was passed in 1966, the vision was much broader.
And the NHPA had a really expansive view of why preservation mattered. It wasn't just about saving old buildings.
It absolutely did. It declared that the historical and cultural foundations of the nation should be preserved as a living part of our community life for a sense of orientation for the American people.
Sense of orientation, I like that.
Me too. And crucially, it stated that this irreplaceable heritage was in the public interest for its wide-ranging benefits. Cultural, educational, aesthetic, inspirational, but explicitly also its economic and energy benefits.
The economic part is key here.
Exactly. That inclusion of economic benefits was foundational for the work we're discussing now.
So the scope evolved significantly beyond just saving famous houses or battlefields.
Totally. It expanded to include archaeological sites. Entire historic neighborhoods, cities like Charleston and New Orleans were pioneers, adopting historic district commissions way back in the 1920s and 30s.
Early adopters.
Very much so. And then it expanded further to cultural landscapes and eventually became deeply intertwined with concepts like sustainable development, downtown revitalization, heritage tourism, outdoor recreation, and broader economic development goals.
And this evolution is precisely why the need to measure the economic impact became so critical, because it was doing so much more.
Exactly. Because preservation evolved from a niche cultural activity to a proven, effective tool for achieving a wide range of community goals like fostering small businesses, creating affordable housing, promoting sustainable development, stabilizing neighborhoods, revitalizing city centers, creating jobs, supporting arts and culture, renewing small towns, and boosting heritage tourism.
Wow, that's a long list.
It is. And because of that, there was a growing need to quantify how effective it was in these areas. Today's preservation landscape is a complex matrix involving numerous federal, state, and local laws and incentives, alongside countless advocacy groups across public, private, and nonprofit sectors, operating from diverse geographic, political, social, and economic perspectives. To demonstrate its value amidst all this, you need data. You need the numbers.
Tell us a bit more about the research process for the report this section draws from. It sounds like it was a concerted effort, not just a quick study.
It was. The report was funded by the Economic Development Administration, EDA, which reflects the federal government's interest in this. It specifically responded to Presidential Executive Order 13287, known as Preserve America.
Preserve America, okay.
And that order directed federal agencies to promote the use of historic properties for heritage tourism and economic development as a strategy for their long-term preservation. It also followed a specific recommendation that came out of the 2006 Preserve America Summit, which was part of the commemoration of the NHPA's 40th anniversary.
So it was policy-driven research responding to a government need.
Yes, very much so. The process involved extensive interviews with a wide range of experts from the public, nonprofit, and private sectors, people with a deep knowledge of preservation economics.
What did they ask them?
They were asked about existing data and methodologies for measuring economic impact, but also critically, what kind of data and analysis they needed in the future, what would actually be useful. A major takeaway from these interviews was the strong desire for data that was not just academically sound, but usable, sustainable.
Sustainable meaning?
Meaning it could be collected consistently over time, not just a one-off snapshot, and annualizable, allowing for yearly comparisons and tracking trends.
And they brought in international perspectives, too. It wasn't just U.S. focused.
Yes, they held an international symposium specifically to understand best practices and gather recommendations from leading scholars and practitioners worldwide. Keynote speakers included representatives from significant global institutions like the World Bank and the ICCG Brussels Management School, with commentators from organizations such as the World Monuments Fund. So yes, it was definitely an effort to draw on global expertise in measuring the value of heritage.
So what were the key findings and overall issues that consistently emerged from all these interviews and the International Symposium? What were the big takeaways?
Well, there was very strong agreement across the board on the fundamental need for quantifiable metrics to measure preservation's economic impact. That was number one.
Okay.
There was also consensus that despite a growing body of work, critical research into the specific relationship between economics and preservation was still needed. A key issue highlighted was that multiple different groups, legislators, tourism professionals, community advocates, developers, all need this data, but they often need it in different forms and levels of detail.
Different audiences need different things.
Exactly. Legislators might want data specific to their local district, what's happening on the ground there, while tourism pros want big headline numbers for marketing campaigns.
And the data itself has to be reliable and consistently available, right? You can't just make it up.
Crucially so. The information must be consistent over time, credible to diverse audiences, and its collection and dissemination need to be ongoing, not just sporadic studies. And while the underlying research methodologies must be academically robust to ensure credibility,
It has to be solid research.
absolutely. But the final findings need to be presented clearly in non-academic terms that are understandable to policymakers and the general public. That's a tricky balance to strike, rigorous but accessible.
And it's not just the government's job to collect this data.
No. While government agencies like state historic preservation offices have a vital role, it was recognized that private and nonprofit institutions might also need to take responsibility for collecting and analyzing certain types of data. There's a clear overarching need for better data collection in general.
Better in what way?
Improving the type of data collected, ensuring its objectivity, increasing the frequency of collection, and establishing clearly who is responsible for collecting data where. The economic impact of preservation regulations and zoning on property values was also specifically identified as a necessary area for consistent measurement. That comes up a lot.
And just having the data isn't enough if it's locked away somewhere.
Exactly. Data needs to be more readily available and easily shared among different stakeholders. Another significant finding was the need to broaden the definition of economic impact. It shouldn't just be limited to easily quantifiable things like jobs created or direct property value increases.
Broaden it. How?
Well, the idea of economics once removed was highlighted as important, particularly relating to environmental data.
Economics once removed. Can you unpack that a bit? What does that mean?
Think of it as the economic value derived from benefits that aren't direct financial transactions related to the preservation work itself, but are nonetheless real and valuable to the economy and society. Environmental benefits are a prime example.
Like, what kind of environmental benefits?
This includes things like the economic value of reducing construction waste that would otherwise go to landfills, the value of the embodied energy.
Embodied energy.
Yeah, all the energy that was used to mine, manufacture, and transport materials to build the existing structure in the first place, which is conserved when you reuse a building instead of demolishing it and building new. It's also the value of saving green fields from development by reusing sites in existing built-up areas, preserving open space.
That makes sense.
Right. But our sources point out that despite federal mandates to reduce carbon footprint and promote sustainability, the inherent environmental attributes and cost savings of existing buildings are often not included in current sustainable building calculation methods, like LEED points, for example. That's a gap where this economics once removed thinking is vital.
Were there significant challenges identified in the existing economic research on preservation? Things that weren't working well?
Yes, several. A key one is that some studies focus too much on gross output rather than conveying net economic benefits, meaning the overall gain after accounting for costs or alternative uses of resources. What else could that money have done?
Right, the opportunity cost.
Exactly. Data is often scattered, inconsistent, or simply lacking, requiring expensive primary research for each study. State governments are increasingly scrutinizing the return on investment for state preservation tax credits, demanding clear data to justify these programs.
Makes sense. They want to know if it's worth it.
Absolutely. And counterintuitively, despite historic rehabilitation being highly labor-intensive, preservation sometimes faces weak support from labor unions. There's a hypothesis that this might be due to factors like the specialized nature of preservation trades or historical disconnects, but the lack of strong union advocacy was noted as a challenge.
Interesting.
And critically, data is needed not just at the broad national or state levels, but with geographic specificity at the local level. That's what's most relevant to local officials and legislators making decisions about their communities.
It sounds like having solid, consistent data is absolutely key for advocating for preservation and its related incentives, like tax credits.
It came up repeatedly. Using robust, credible data to support federal tax credits, for instance, including lobbying for potential expansion of those credits, perhaps to non-commercial properties, the market size threshold needs study was seen as a vital application for this research. Understanding the costs versus savings of using existing buildings compared to new construction is a fundamental piece of that argument.
Okay, so given all these findings and the clear need for better data, the report recommended 5 specific areas for annual measurement. Let's dive into those. What's the first recommended metric?
The first, and probably the most frequently cited indicator of economic impact, is jobs and household income.
Jobs, always important.
Always. This is key because job creation data resonates strongly with policymakers and the public. Data on jobs created is often already collected, especially for projects utilizing tax credits, and there are widely accepted economic methodologies for translating investment in preservation into estimates of jobs and income generated. Local officials and taxing jurisdictions are particularly eager for this type of data because it directly relates to local economic activity, tax revenue, things they care about.
And how is that typically measured in economic studies? What's the method?
It's usually measured using what are called input-output multipliers. These are sophisticated economic models. Common ones are RIMS-2 or IMPLAN that analyze the interdependencies between different sectors of an economy.
Okay, input-output. How does that work?
Think of it like dropping a stone into a pond. There's the initial splash, that's the direct impact. Then the ripples spreading out, those are the indirect impacts as suppliers buy from their suppliers. And then the wider movement of the water as everything settles, those are the induced impacts from household spending.
Right, the ripple effect.
Exactly. These models estimate the direct effects the jobs and income directly generated by the preservation activity itself. The indirect effects the jobs and income created in industries that supply goods and services to the preservation projects and businesses, and the induced effects the jobs and income generated when the people working in the directly and indirectly affected industries spend their wages locally, buying groceries, going out, etc.
What are the strengths of using these models? Why use them?
Well, the methodology using IO multipliers is well established, widely understood by economists, and relatively easy to apply once you have the initial investment data. It allows for direct comparison to job creation numbers claimed by other industries.
So you can compare apples to apples, sort of.
Right. And a significant strength for preservation is that historic rehabilitation is inherently more labor-intensive than new construction. It often requires specialized skills.
More hands-on work.
Exactly. This means a higher proportion of the project cost goes to labor, which translates into significant local economic impact and can provide potentially higher wage jobs, sometimes for individuals without advanced formal education.
But where are the weaknesses or areas for improvement with this measurement? It can't be perfect.
No, several weaknesses. This type of analysis is often done only sporadically, perhaps every few years, or limited to a statewide level, not local. Crucially, it often only includes projects that receive preservation tax credits, missing significant private investment that doesn't use credits.
So it undercounts.
Potentially, yes. It frequently doesn't use the full range of available data from sources like the National Park Service, the Department of Commerce, the Department of Labor, or the General Services Administration. There's a need to better distinguish between permanent, ongoing jobs, like museum staff, versus temporary jobs associated with the construction phase.
Construction jobs versus permanent jobs. Big difference.
Big difference. And a key analytical challenge is determining what percentage of measured projects wouldn't have happened at all without the preservation incentives. Is the incentive driving the entire economic activity, or just making a project feasible that might have happened anyway, just differently?
That's a tough one to figure out.
Very tough. There's also a need for more comparative analysis. What are the economic impacts of investing the same resources in preservation versus investing them elsewhere, like funding more teachers or highway patrolmen, as one expert suggested in the source?
Right, comparing different public spending choices.
Exactly. Tax credits are essentially tax expenditures, money the government isn't collecting, and like direct grants, they require analysis of their outcomes and return on public investment, not just their outputs. So the recommendation is to measure annually the jobs and income from all historic rehabilitation activity, federal, state, local, non-incentivized private investment, and other preservation-related employment, compiling the direct, indirect, and induced impacts with clear definitions. A much bigger picture.
Okay, that's comprehensive. Metric 2 focuses on property values. This seems like a big one, too.
Yes, this metric is considered crucial because it provides tangible data on how historic district designation impacts surrounding areas, which is something homeowners and local governments care a lot about. It aims to measure the year-to-year change in value for residential properties specifically located within historic districts and compare that change to similar properties located just outside those districts.
And the goal is to find that heritage premium.
Exactly. The goal is often to identify if there's a heritage premium, essentially, an added monetary value or higher appreciation rate paid for properties simply because they are located within a designated historic district. Does designation itself add value?
How do they measure that heritage premium? What are the methods?
There are a couple of main approaches. Simpler methods involve comparison analyses. looking at how values change for properties before and after a historic district designation, comparing the rate of appreciation for properties within the district to the overall appreciation rate of the local housing market, or comparing the appreciation rate within a historic district to that of similar non-historic neighborhoods nearby.
Comparing like with like.
Trying to, yes. A more sophisticated method is called hedonic pricing.
Hedonic pricing. That sounds technical again.
It is, but the concept is fairly straightforward. It uses complex mathematical models to try and isolate the monetary contribution of specific variables to a property's sale price.
Variables like.
Think of it like this. A house price is influenced by its size, number of bedrooms, bathrooms, lot size, whether it has a garage or a pool, its age, condition, and location. Hedonic models try to statistically account for all these other quantifiable factors. After accounting for everything else that contributes to value, any remaining difference in price between a property in a historic district and a comparable one outside might be attributed to the historic designation.
So it tries to isolate the historic district effect.
Precisely. But it requires good knowledge of which variables are significant drivers for buyers and sellers in that specific market.
What kind of data do they use for these analyses? Where does it come from?
Data sources typically include records of actual market transactions, home sales, or assessed value for taxation purposes. Assessed value is often used as a proxy for market value because assessment databases are widely available, can provide a very large quantity of data, and facilitate mapping analysis using geographic information systems, GIS.
GIS mapping helps visualize it.
Yes. And while there might be minor errors in individual assessments, the sheer quantity of data can outweigh these, provided the overall ratio between market value and assessed value is consistent across the area being studied. Another approach is tracking resales of the same property over time to see how its value appreciates relative to others.
The strength seems to be that this data is pretty neutral, not collected for preservation necessarily.
Yes, that's a major strength. The data source's tax assessments or market transactions are generally indifferent to historic preservation, which reduces potential advocacy bias in the raw data. The large quantity of data available from assessment records, in particular, allows for robust statistical analysis.
But what are the weaknesses?
Weaknesses include the fact that this research is often conducted irregularly, is highly localized, or based on limited samples. There is no consistent national data set. Measurement approaches vary widely, making comparisons difficult, and broader market fluctuations can easily skew the picture if not accounted for properly. The recommendation is for consistent analysis and data collection over time, ideally using national real estate data firms that could potentially incorporate historic district boundaries into their analysis, like S&P Schiller or Zillow data, but with added historic designation information.
Metric 3 is heritage tourism. This feels like a very direct link between preservation and the economy that many people immediately think of. History draws tourists.
Absolutely. Tourism is a massive global growth industry, and heritage tourism travel, motivated specifically by a desire to experience history, culture, and historic places, is consistently shown to be one of its fastest-growing segments. Many states rank tourism very highly in terms of its contribution to employment and economic activity, and heritage is a significant driver for that.
What exactly do studies in this area measure? What are they looking for?
They look at both the demand side and the supply side. Demand side includes things like the number of visitors, how long they stay, where they come from, how they travel, where they lodge, what specific historic sites or attractions they visit, whether heritage was the primary driver for their trip.
Why did they come?
Exactly. What other places they visit while they're there and their demographic characteristics. And the supply side, the availability of accommodations, the number and type of activity venues like museums and historic sites and heritage-related events.
And then they translate that into economics.
Yes, the economic measurements then translate this into things like expenditure per day or per trip, how that money is allocated across different sectors, lodging, food, retail, attractions, job creation, tax generation for state and local governments, and comparisons of spending and impact between heritage tourists versus all tourists. Satisfaction indicators are also important. Are heritage tourists happy with their experience? Will they come back? Recommend it.
What are the main data challenges with measuring heritage tourism? It sounds like a lot to track.
A big challenge is that data on heritage tourism isn't always readily available separately from general tourism data or data related to public lands or outdoor recreation. Different studies use different baselines, different definitions of heritage tourist.
Who counts as a heritage tourist?
Right, that's a key definitional problem. And different methodologies make it hard to compare results across regions or over time. Tourism professionals often want simple, big numbers, heads in beds, tax revenue for marketing, which can sometimes oversimplify the picture. Key questions persist. How much more do heritage travelers spend than general tourists? Do they stay longer? How many are there? And what truly sets them apart demographically and behaviorally?
How are these measurements approached, given the data challenges?
Approaches often involve starting with larger, existing tourism datasets and trying to disaggregate or identify the subset that qualifies as heritage visitors, maybe based on survey questions about their motivations or activities. Another method is calculating the incrementally greater impact of heritage tourists compared to general tourists. Surveys are commonly used one-on-one interviews at sites, phone or mail surveys, or online surveys, though accuracy concerns vary with method.
But is there a consistent finding that emerges despite the varying methods? Do heritage tourists behave differently?
Yes, this is one of the most consistent findings in preservation economics research. Comparative analyses almost invariably show that heritage tourists, however they are defined in a particular study, tend to stay longer in a destination, visit more different places or attractions, and spend more money per day or per trip than general tourists.
So they're more valuable tourists, economically speaking.
Generally, yes. This results in a significantly greater per-trip economic impact. So, while definitional problems about exactly who counts as a heritage tourist, or how certain expenditures like transportation should be included in local impact analysis persist, the core finding about their higher value is robust. The recommendation is to measure annually the number of heritage visitors, their demographic characteristics and average spending compared to all tourists, and their percentage of total tourism, using consistent data collection methods, perhaps integrated into existing state tourism agency surveys or data from national parks and heritage areas.
Metric 4 shifts to environmental measurements. This feels particularly important given current global concerns about sustainability and climate change.
It is. There is a rapidly growing consensus that historic preservation makes significant positive contributions to broader environmental goals. This includes areas like sustainable development, promoting smart growth by reusing existing urban footprints instead of sprawling outwards, energy conservation through reuse of buildings, and overall green planning initiatives.
What kind of specific things can actually be measured in this area? How do you put a number on that?
Well, potential metrics include the infrastructure cost savings realized when you reuse a building on an existing site with roads, sewers, power already there versus building new infrastructure for greenfield development. Quantifying the embodied energy, as we discussed.
The energy locked in the existing materials.
Exactly. That energy saved through rehabilitation rather than demolition and new construction. And estimating the amount of greenfields, undeveloped land that are saved from development because preservation activity focuses investment in existing built areas. Data sources exist with environmental organizations like the EPA, the Urban Land Institute, and construction materials recycling associations.
Is the research in this environmental area as developed as, say, jobs or property values, or is it newer?
Our sources indicate that research in this specific area is newer and still very much evolving. Different approaches and methodologies are being tested to figure out the best ways to quantify these complex environmental benefits in economic terms.
So it's still figuring itself out.
A bit, yes. Because the field is still developing, the recommendation from the report is that while environmental impact should definitely be an annual measurement area for preservation, the specific metrics and methods used should perhaps be deferred for a few years to allow the research methodologies to mature and standardize. It's linked to policy failures, too. For example, environmental impact assessments often fail to convey these specific economic benefits of preservation. And as we mentioned earlier, the attributes of existing buildings are often not adequately included in current sustainable building calculations.
Finally, Metric 5 focuses on downtown revitalization and the Main Street program. This seems very visible on the ground.
Yes, this metric highlights the very visible and widely recognized role that historic preservation plays in the revitalization of downtown areas across the country. The Main Street program, developed by the National Trust for Historic Preservation, is a national model that explicitly frames downtown revitalization as economic development within the context of historic preservation. Its success is based on leveraging the historic character of a place as a tool for economic growth.
How does the Main Street program measure its impact currently? They must track something.
They do. The program has a decentralized data collection system. Local Main Street managers in individual towns collect basic data from their communities and report it up to their state Main Street program office, which then aggregates the data and sends it to the National Main Street Center.
What kind of data do they collect?
The core data they collect includes things like net new jobs created, net new businesses established, the amount of public and private investment made in physical improvements, building renovations, streetscape projects, and the number of building rehabilitations completed. Some states add other metrics like the number of volunteer hours contributed to the program, attendance at downtown festivals, the number of historic buildings sold, business expansions, facade improvements, and new housing units created in upper floors of historic buildings. They also calculate a leverage figure.
What does that leverage figure represent? How much bang for the buck?
Kind of, yeah. The leverage figure is calculated by dividing the total dollar amount of investment, both public and private, made in the downtown district by the operating cost of the local Main Street program. It's meant to show how much private and public investment is leveraged or stimulated for every dollar invested in the preservation-based Main Street program itself.
What are considered the strengths of this data collection system? They've been doing it a while.
A major strength is the sheer consistency of data collection. The program has been collecting data using relatively similar metrics for almost 30 years now. The data points gathered are also generally appropriate for measuring the direct outcomes of the Main Street program's activities. However, there are notable weaknesses.
Like the lack of comparison we talked about earlier.
That's a major one. There's generally no comparative analysis done. The data shows what happened in Main Street towns, but it doesn't compare their performance to similar towns without a Main Street program, or even to other areas within the same town that aren't part of the Main Street district.
So you can't be sure the program caused the changes.
Right. It makes it hard to definitively say how much of the observed activity is caused by the Main Street program and its preservation focus versus broader economic trends or other local factors. Another weakness is that local managers are responsible for acquiring and verifying the data from various sources, which can lead to potential inconsistencies in how data is defined or collected from town to town.
So the recommendation is for more sophisticated analysis here, too.
Exactly. The report recommends conducting comparative analysis. It also strongly advocates for measuring the catalytic impact of preservation projects. This goes beyond just looking at the immediate numbers for a specific project or year. It involves looking at changes over a longer period.
Longer-term view.
Yes, say 5 to 10 years before and after a major preservation project or program is implemented in a downtown.
What kind of changes would they look for in that catalytic impact analysis? What shows a ripple effect?
They would look at changes in property values in the surrounding area, changes in retail sales volume, overall investment levels, job growth, the number and type of businesses operating, and commercial occupancy rates. It's about understanding the ripple effect, how preserving and revitalizing one key building or block can stimulate positive activity and value throughout the wider district.
Where would they get that data?
Data sources for this kind of catalytic impact study would include things like building permit records, historical city directories, Chamber of Commerce listings, Business Improvement District, BID data, surveys of business owners, and property tax records, pulling lots of sources together.
So we've covered the historical depth, the complex histories, modern challenges, and the detailed work of trying to put a number on the value of historic places. What's the path forward outlined by these sources, particularly the report on economic impact? What needs to happen next?
Well, the core conclusions are reiterated clearly. Research into the connection between historic preservation and the economy is absolutely critical. A growing body of research does exist, which is promising, but it's not being done on a regular, consistent national level, which limits its overall impact and comparability.
And it needs to be understandable.
Right. Findings need to be presented in accessible, non-academic terms for policymakers and the public, but the underlying methodologies must always be transparent, academically robust, and replicable to ensure credibility. You need both rigor and clarity.
So the fundamental need is to systematize and improve the data collection process, make it more consistent and reliable.
Precisely. Data collection needs improvement across the board in the type of data gathered, ensuring its objectivity, increasing the frequency of collection, and clearly assigning responsibility for who collects what data where. This, of course, requires dedicated funding, which is always a persistent challenge for research.
Always the funding question.
Always. The report offers several specific recommendations to address this.
Like identifying who is responsible for the research, sorting out who does what,
Yes, a key first step is identifying which organizations or agencies are best positioned and willing to take responsibility for conducting the research for each of the recommended metrics. Then, establishing a long-term research, evaluation, and reporting plan is essential.
A roadmap.
Exactly. This plan needs to clearly lay out who does what, when, how the results from different areas or metrics will be aggregated, and how they will be published and effectively distributed to the relevant audiences. Get the information out there.
And setting baselines is crucial for measuring change over time, isn't it?
Absolutely vital. For each of the recommended metrics, a clear baseline needs to be defined, the starting point against which annual changes will be measured. The plan needs to specify how that initial base data will be acquired. Finally, systematizing data collection means ensuring that the methodologies used are consistently applied year after year, are fully transparent so others can understand them, and are academically robust to stand up to scrutiny. Consistency is key.
Were there specific data needs highlighted related to particular programs or concepts that need more attention?
Yes. For instance, continuing to measure the heritage premium that added value from being in a historic district is seen as important for demonstrating the market value of preservation designation. For the federal rehabilitation tax incentive, a very important program,
Hugely important.
there's a specific need for more detailed data on its geographic distribution. Where is the money actually going? Is it reaching low-income areas or specific congressional districts as intended? More data is also needed to clearly show the costs versus savings of using existing buildings compared to new construction, which is crucial for making the economic and environmental case.
And this data helps support the program.
Absolutely. This data is vital for lobbying support for the credit and for understanding the potential and implications of expanding its use, perhaps to non-commercial properties, although the market size threshold for such an expansion needs careful study. Data drives policy.
You mentioned earlier the lack of research on social impacts in the U.S., beyond just counting housing units.
Right. That was identified as a significant gap. There's very limited U.S.-based research on the social impacts of preservation, things like community cohesion, quality of life, sense of place, social equity. Comprehensive European models, like the Livable Cities project mentioned, exist and incorporate a much broader range of social factors, but these are often very time-consuming and expensive to replicate.
So what's the suggestion there?
There's recognized potential for partnering with other urban-focused entities in the U.S., maybe foundations, universities, community development organizations, to try and undertake this kind of broader social impact research. It's an area needing attention.
So ultimately, the path forward is about bridging the gap between academic research and practical application in policy, making the research useful.
That's exactly it. It's about ensuring that economic methods aren't just used for academic exercises, but are applied directly to practical problems in the field of historic preservation. It's about creating effective ways to bridge the gap between what academic researchers are capable of and what preservation advocates and policymakers actually need to make their case effectively and demonstrate the value of preservation in ways that resonate.
And the conclusion is pretty stark if that doesn't happen.
Yes, the report concludes with a strong statement. Historic preservation cannot reach its full potential to contribute to the economy or society without this necessary research being done consistently and credibly. The data is foundational.
So to recap this deep dive, we've journeyed from the fortified beginnings and power-hungry builders of English palaces, traced their decline and adaptation while also confronting the difficult, complex legacies of empire embedded within their very fabric. We looked at how modern rural estates are facing similar pressures of economic change and finding new strategies for survival, sometimes drawing on lessons from the past.
Yes.
And finally, we've delved into the detailed, sometimes complex, but crucial work of measuring preservation's tangible dollars and cents impact on jobs, property values, tourism, and the environment in American communities.
The key takeaway from all of this, I think, is clear. Historic places are far more than just static markers of the past or pretty backdrops. They are dynamic, evolving assets with complex histories we are still uncovering and grappling with, and they have measurable, tangible impacts on local economies and communities today.
And understanding that value isn't simple.
No, understanding their full value requires looking beyond sentimentality to robust data and analysis, embracing the difficult truths about their origins and connections to global power structures, and constantly adapting strategies for their continued life and relevance in a changing world. It's an ongoing process.
It makes you think. Consider how the challenges we discussed facing a historic English manor house, rising costs of upkeep, the need to find new income streams, confronting difficult historical narratives. How might those resonate with the struggles of revitalizing a historic downtown district in the U.S., trying to attract new businesses and residents while preserving its unique character?
Yeah, there are definite parallels, aren't there? What universal truths about the value and vulnerability of history, about adaptation and relevance, can we glean from these seemingly disparate examples?
And maybe what responsibility do we have as individuals who live amongst these places, who benefit from the character and history they provide, to understand their full value, the good and the bad, and advocate for their continued life and relevance in our communities?
That's a great question. It's certainly something to mull over long after this deep dive is done.